But the final outcome of the whole thing is the student gets a mark in the subject. And you have to ask, what on earth is the meaning of a mark? There's a few possibilities. One possibility, perhaps the mark corresponds to the student's standard in the subject. But then perhaps the exam didn't cover the subject properly, or the marking scheme didn't distinguish between more in-depth knowledge and more superficial knowledge. Or perhaps the student was lucky and guessed the questions. Or perhaps the student was unlucky. I remember one case where somebody got 597 out of 600 in maths, getting first in Ireland. It wasn't me, and I don't believe it was Danny. Never mind. And the reason he dropped the 3 marks was he wrote down that the cube root of 27 was 9. It's a completely safe assumption that he knew better. So interpreting the mark as an indicator of somebody's standard in the subject is fraught with peril. A different interpretation is the student's ability for the subject. And there are further hazards, because that can be disguised a bit by the circumstances in which the student found themselves. Perhaps their teacher was not very good, and so on and so forth. And of course, this all applies even when there's absolutely no errors in the marking per se, these uncertainties. But of course, there's always likely to be some error. Now, the State Examination Commission is very, very well aware of these problems, does everything it can to try to address them and remedy. And it comes up with an examination and a marking arrangement such that it's valid to interpret the mark as indicating the student's standard in the subject, keeping in mind that it's not precise. Up to, well, a long, long time ago, that's where things ended. But a few years ago, it became necessary to put another interpretation on the mark. And that interpretation has to do with the answer to the question, who did better? That's a purely competitive question, nothing to do with the standard. It only arises, for example, as we know, in relation to the shortage of third-level cases and so on. So when you try to answer that question, well, the answer is going to be some kind of number, typically called the leaving cert points. And it's meant to indicate not the standard that a student has achieved, but how well the student has done compared to other students. How can one get that interpretation in a reasonable way from the mark? If there's only one exam, it's fairly straightforward. Bigger the mark, better we've done. But if there's more than one exam, there are a lot of other factors that need to be taken into account. So we have the mark in the exam. There's a number of different interpretations can be placed on it. Overall, one might say that the best that can be said is the mark indicates the student's performance in the exam. Thanks to the SEC's efforts, it can be interpreted as the standard of the student in the subject, but all the time one has to keep in mind it's not completely precise. So we need to get the points from the mark. The way that's done at the moment is like this. And this is quite an interesting diagram, I think, when you look at it. One of the first things is marks have kind of disappeared.
Sorry, excuse me. The slides aren't moving on Zoom. So Paul, I think you need to go up and stop share and restart share again. Thanks. Sorry to interrupt you.
Here, how do you stop it when it goes into this display mode? You can't see what I'm seeing here.
Okay, so if you just go down to the very bottom bar, Paul.
3 bars?
No, on the very bottom. Oh yeah, see there, you need to go 3 bars, yeah. And then go hide presenter view.
Okay. Can you see that moving now?
Perfect, thanks.
You know, in a former life, I was supposed to know a bit about computing. But do you think I'd have any ability to resolve any of these problems? Not a chance. But looking at this diagram, which indicates the way the points have got at the moment, I don't know if it's possible to remove the stuff on the top right there. Might be. But as I said, so we've moved to having grades, not marks, really. And it's just 8 grades. And they correspond to those markdowns that are mentioned there. And lo and behold, you get a 1, the mark gives you a grade, the points are then based upon the grade. That's simple, that's nice, isn't it? But it means that if you get 69 and I get 60, I get the same points as you, despite the difference of 9 marks between us. And everyone who's marked an examination paper, I would say, would agree that a difference of 9 marks out of 100 between 2 students is significant. Another thing that's noticeable is how very few alternatives there are in terms of grades and in terms of points for each examination. The ordinary level examinations can only give rise to 7 different points values. Those examinations can be taken by, let's say, over 20,000 students. There are 45 exams that are taken by more than 1,000 students. You're dividing them into 7 different categories for the purposes of putting them in merit order. Whereas at the same time, they have potentially 100 different marks. Why would you reduce your potential spread, for being able to distinguish to that extent? And when you look at the thing for the subjects, for most subjects, the possible number of different points you can get is just 11. That's across both ordinary level and higher level, and foundation level which applies. So when you put together the higher level marks and the ordinary level marks, you potentially have a range of, say, about 200 or something. So why would you try and throw away that level of discrimination and reduce it to just 11? Or in this case of mathematics, to 200, or in the case of mathematics, to 30. A really striking thing about the diagram there in a way also is, okay, it distinguishes between mathematics and other subjects, but there is no other distinction between subjects. The assumption is that a grade in subject A is equivalent in terms of merit order to the same grade in subject B. And that does seem to be a little bit hard to credit. So how does this emphasis on grades come? And why are the grades what they are, and so on? They're basically on decile boundaries, which go from 59 to 60 and so on. There's no particular significance to a decile boundary. There are certain widths, it's not clear why they apply. They're 10 because they're on decile boundaries and so on. And a really significant thing about the leaving cert grades is the original data is the mark. And in arriving at the grade is determined just mechanically from the mark, with no attempt to sort of review it, as might happen at 3rd level or whatever. Now, one reason that might be behind this emphasis on grades is the notion that by using grades, you reduce the effects of errors in the marking. The catch with that is that that might be true if the measurements in question all relate to the same entity. So you make multiple measurements of the same thing, you get a range of values, you group them together, maybe you add them and get a mean. Your mean is a better estimate of the thing, etc. That approach absolutely does not work if the entities you're dealing with are different entities. Maura's mark in, say, Irish, and Sean's mark in Irish have nothing to do with each other, except the fact that it's in Irish. There's no earthly reason to think that you can eliminate errors in some way by putting them together. Much better to leave them alone. And the whole process of doing the grading and using grades for points itself introduces errors. One of the worst of these, one might say, has to do with the fact that the different marking distributions for the different subjects are ignored. So if you look here, just for the last 3 years or so, the table shows the proportion of the students that got less than 60% on the higher level table. Okay. So if you look at 2022, well, if you got 60% on the higher level paper, you did better than 70% of those who did maths, 61 of those who did Irish, 61%, and so on along. Looking at those differences between different subjects, how can anyone say that the same grade corresponds to the same merit order? Take Maura, for example, who, let's say, got 61. Say Maura was doing Irish. She got the mark 60% in the higher level paper. She's done better than 61% of the other students. Sean, getting the same mark in history, is only doing better than about 38% of the students. It can't really be said that those two grades correspond to the same merit order. It seems clearly wrong to do that. And not only is there the introduction of an error as a result of ignoring the mark distribution, which have serious side effects. Students have to choose which subjects they're going to take. I doubt if there's anybody in the room here who hasn't heard somebody say that we're looking to see which subject has a higher number of higher grades. Doing things in this way drives the students not towards picking the subjects that are most suited for themselves and in which they're most interested, but it drives them towards the subjects that just happen to be a higher proportion of higher grades. And as you can see, there's quite a lot of differences between the subjects there. Another effect of this is not just between the subjects, but also between the years. When you look at the variations there between 2019 and 2022, you can see that in 2022 in maths, to get that mark, you had to do better than 70% of the other students. Look at it in 2019, 80%. And you see similar patterns all around. Various places to greater or less degree. So the business of basing the leading set of merit order points on the grades in a way that makes no distinction between the distributions in the different subjects, one can argue, I think, is clearly clear. There are other effects as well. You're marking an exam. You arrive at a mark. You follow the marking scheme precisely. The mark turns out to be 59. You're a nice, kind marker. What do? You go looking for a way to find an extra mark so you can bump the student up to the next grade. And when you look at the marks that are actually allocated, looking at the ones for 2015 and 2016, it turns out about 20,000 students had a mark in one of the subjects they took that ended in the digit 9. That's suspicious digit. When you examine it, you find that essentially it appears that the proportion of marks that are ending in 9, instead of being roughly 1/10, is roughly 3/4 of that. A simple binomial, expansion with 6 items, taking the probability of 9 as 0.075, gives you a pattern that's very similar to the pattern that's actually observed. So why on earth would the likelihood of 9 popping up be significantly less than the probability of other things? After all, the mark is arrived at by adding up the marks for a number of questions, and in each case you're adding up parts of those questions, and the mark for each part depends on the judgment of the marker. And there would appear a priori, at least, to be no reason why you would expect the total to end up preferring one ending digit rather than one. But having it like this, and having this influence on the markers, introduces another source of variability in the marking process. Some students are luckier to get the kinder markers, and so on. So it makes it, again, a bit trickier to use the mark, to use the grade as the merit, to give you the merit of. Far from grades helping correct errors, as I think occasionally been suggested by grouping things together. In many cases, the grades actually are amplifying the errors. And you can see why. You can imagine that when somebody is given a grade, it really corresponds to giving them the mark that's at the center point of that grade. So if you're given a mark of, say, 59, and for some reason you should have been given a mark of 60, you can see that giving that person essentially the grade they now get is the one that corresponds, is 54.5, corresponds to 54.5. They should have got 60, just treating it as a mark, but now what they're getting is an error by 5.5 marks, and so on. Far from grouping of the marks helping manage any errors that are there, near the boundaries of the grades is going to actually amplify. And you can try a few more examples quite easily. And the thing is as well that the bigger the error in the mark, the more amplification there is as you're moving to the midpoint of a different grade and so on. So, using the grades instead of the marks, that's, let's say, maybe not a great idea. But when the move was made to the new point system, where instead of the grades being based on bands of 5 marks as previously, they're based on bands of 10 marks, and your total possible points, let's say, are 625 or something. If things are done in banks of 10 marks, you've only got something like 62 or 3 different possible outcomes overall. Whereas previously, with things moving in groups of 5 marks, you had double that number of possible outcomes. So with the smaller number of possible outcomes, you're going to have much greater numbers on each total points value and much greater reliance on random selection. So how do you address them? Well, the approach that was taken was to allocate the points to different grades, not on the basis of increasing the points by 10 points every time you moved up to the next 10, to the next decimal, but to choose different amounts each time. And apart from the initial step from, say, 0 to something, you're going to be getting either 8 or 10 or 11 or 12 additional points each time. But there seems to be no reason for doing that other than to try to arrange things so that a large number of possible totals is now given. And that was done, not for educational reasons. And if you look at it, you'll find that there's now 570 possible totals available thanks to using these variations. However, it's not as simple as that, because the totals are in no sense uniformly likely to be achieved. When you look at it, there is significant gaps in the total that can, the different totals that can occur, particularly at the top level. Where, for example, if you don't have maths as one of your 6 best subjects, if you don't have maths as one of the 6 best subjects, between 550 points and 600 points, there's nearly something like 11 possible marks that can be achieved. If you're using ordinary level, if ordinary level maths is one of your 6 best, above 530 points, there's only 7 different possibilities. If you're doing higher level maths, there's a wider range of possibilities. But again, there are significant gaps. And when you go looking at what this means, you begin to find something a little strange. If you apply the old leaving cert point system, where the grades were in 5-mark steps, and the points correspondingly went up by 5 points each time, and you apply that to the marks for I have forgotten which year, 2016. If you apply that to the marks for 2016, you get a distribution like this. Probably not terribly different from what one might expect. When you apply the current system to those same identical marks for 2016, this is the kind of distribution you get. Now, it's hard to know how to describe it as a distribution of a measured quality. The word that comes to my mind is bizarre. It's even, so what's basically happening is that, right, there are 570 possibilities, but some of them can be arrived at in maybe 50 different ways, and some of them can only be arrived at in a small number of different ways. And that's particularly true, for example, if you look at the situation up near the high end of the scale, where there's just taking those 10 point values there, those are the only ones that can occur above 581. But when you look at them, you can see that some of them are much more likely to occur than others. It's not evenly spread. It's as that previous thing showed, things going up and down like notices. In fact, for those high points, despite the fact that there's 10 or 11 possibilities, only 4 of them really are at the races. The same kind of thing happens also in the middle of the range when one looks at it. If you look at around 400 points, you can see that there was 150, 101, 150, then back to 56 and 23 and 13 and 60 and 231. Now, what is the point of things going up and down? So, kind of summarizing a bit about the current point system, basing it on grades as it's currently done introduces a whole variety of different kinds of errors. The most obvious one is the ignoring of the 9 marks between, say, 60 and 69, but there's a whole bunch of others. The failure to take into account that the merit order in different subjects is related to the mark in different ways. Failing to take that into account, as we saw earlier, really, this very question. And the final way in which the points are allocated, the points are allocated in these varying ways in order to allow a greater number of possible total values. Really, that doesn't work very well and it reduces other effects. So, in the opinion of Danny and myself, I think this point system, if at all possible, should be changed. So what about an alternative? Well, this is just a proposal. And the idea is to have a merit order that can be used across different subjects and across different years in a fair kind of way. And it's fair. One of the things you want to do is to try to make sure that if an error is made in the mark, the effect of that in the student's points should, as far as possible, correspond to the size of the error. If the error is only 1 mark in the current system, that can shift you to a different grade, and as a result, give you significantly more points. Which implies, I think, that students cannot really be given their marks unless they ask for them, which is the current system. They don't get their marks. Because if one of those 20,000 students who got a mark that ended in 9, got the mark and realized that just 1 mark of the difference would give me all these extra points, the number of appeals that might be coming in will be quite large. So one wants the effect of any marking error to be proportional in terms of the points to the size of the error. And also it's important the system's easy to understand. So the approach we're suggesting goes like this: that you base things on a subject cohort. The subject cohort is all the people who are taking the subject that year at any level, foundation, general, whatever. You use the mark the person has got to give you a subject. And the subject mark is a weighted mark arrived at by perhaps treating the ordinary level marks just as R, treating the higher level marks as worth twice the ordinary ones or 1.5 times, whatever. And once you've given the students in the cohort this standardized mark, it's a straightforward process to rank them according to the mark. So that's standardized. And now when you're coming to the points, well, after all, the points are meant to indicate how well a student has done compared to the other students. So one way of getting at that is simply to award the points on the basis of the proportion of the students in the cohort who got a lower mark than the student. Of course, there could be a number of students who got the same mark as that student. So we want to give them all the same middle of the group kind of way. I'm not sure if anybody here was in the FCA, but as a private soldier way back, we were sometimes given the order, is Irja or Lech or Yesh is Isha or Clay, in on one chain, and we had to line up around the wall, shortest on the left, tallest on the right, and so on. So what we're really trying to do here is something very similar with respect to the cohort, the subject mark. That subject mark, typically it will depend just on the subject, the level, what the exam mark was. Simple way of doing it, as I was saying, was maybe use the ordinary level mark and change, weight the other ones, put them in some way. The factor that comes up in relation to some of the discussions in this area has to do with trying to in some way compensate for the different circumstances that students might have been in when they did the readings. Maybe they had bad teachers, maybe they had good teachers, maybe they could afford grinds, maybe they couldn't, all that kind of thing. So those factors could be put in to coming up with this standardized one. But It'd be quite a dodgy thing to do. Overall, though, the subject mark, when you combine the ordinary level marks with the higher level marks, they're likely to be something in the range from 0 to 200 or something. So you have a very good spread of marks. And you can base the merit points on it. So how to go from the ranking thing to the actual points? Well, a very simple way of doing it would be to count the number of students that have the same mark as the student, count the number of students who have a lower mark than the student, and regard half of those who have the same mark as being lower than the current student, and all of those who have a lower mark, right? And just divide by the total of total less 1 and get a percentage. So now you end up with a points value that's somewhere in the range from 0.0 to 100.0. Well, hopefully, people would say that this is simple and understandable. So, having done that, there is an obvious catch that if the numbers doing the subject are really quite small, you'll have to change the method in some way to allow for that. One possibility is you might group the mark for the current year with marks for the subject in other years, or you might group cognate subjects. It's not unlike what's done now, in a sense. Or you could take some other approach. But certainly it's possible to do. If one looks at the curricular subjects, I think there's no more than 2 of them, right, that were taken by less than 100 students. So you're pretty well certain to have a potential range of 100 marks to play with, or more, in arriving at this rank. But there can always be difficulties due to the numbers being seen. So what are the properties of this kind of an approach? Well, one can argue that it gives a fair indication of how students have done compared to other students. It's not affected by different marking distributions between subjects. It puts no pressure on markers due to grade boundaries. Any errors in marking have a limited effect. They only move people a small distance in the merit scale. The merit points you get for the subject can be added together with the 6 best subjects to give the overall merit. And when that's done, we've now a very wide range of possible values for the overall total of the order of from 0.0 up to, let's say, 600.0. And the numbers are not necessarily integer. Another thing about the system that the system is suggesting is that it encourages students to pick the subjects for which they're most likely to do well compared to other students. In other words, the subjects for which they have the most natural talent, and so on. And finally, it's easy to, I think, but certainly for anyone who's been in the FCA as a private, it's easy to understand. But maybe not everyone has been in the FCA as a private citizen. From a student perspective, the student can be given the subject mark to tell them the standard they've achieved in the subject, and they'll be given their merit points to tell them how well they did compared to the others who took the subject. There's a clear distinction in this approach between the standard the student has reached and how well the student has done competitively. And they really are 2 quite different things. This approach also gives less incentive to appeal a mark, because a small gain in the mark will probably only result in a small gain in the points, unlike the massive gain involved, or the significant gain involved in going from, say, 9 to 59 to 60, or whatever. And as mentioned earlier, student is encouraged to go for the subjects which they have the most talent and so on. And I think the students can see that the system is fair. There was a study done on the current system by the Esri there in 2019. And one of the things that came out of it was a remark from one of the students consulted who said, oh, I don't really think it's fair to be ignoring the difference of 9 marks. Well, that doesn't happen with this system. And it seems it can be made, we would believe, readily understandable by the students themselves. So, trying to wrap up, I'm just worried about time. Not too bad. But trying to wrap up, I think really the current system really is seriously flawed. It's been no harm if people can start thinking about how it might be replaced. The alternative system, an alternative system is needed, maybe such as the one suggested here. One suggested here because of the much wider range of possibilities. There will be much reduced need for random selection. And students can be given their marks without bringing forth an avalanche of appeals. And something, also it seems to be something, this kind of proposed system, we would say, is something that could be seen to be fair by the students. And that would encourage them to do things, to pick the subjects for which they're best suited. Now, most of these points on the slides, they're enlarged upon. I almost said it ad nauseam, not, but they're enlarged upon in the paper. And before wrapping up, though, I'd just like to say that our thanks to the people in the Education Research Unit in St. Vincent Founder, particularly Dr. David Miller. The department made the marks for 2015 and 2016. Understandably enough, they weren't not prepared to make them available to Danny and myself, but they did make them available to the Education Research Centre. We very kindly did whatever processing we needed. And we were very fortunate indeed that they didn't give the marks to us, because we would have had to do an awful lot more work than we ended up needing to do. Thanks also to the department for making the marks available, and to the Society's referees for their helpful comments, also to Gabrielle who's sitting there for her advice and so on. So that's it. Oh, there we go.
So we have 2 votes times before we open it up to the floor. So I don't know who's ready to go first. Amy, yeah. She's sit down, yeah.
I don't have slides.
Okay.
Okay, thanks very much. Do I need the mic? Yeah. Okay. Hi everyone, I'm Amy Doris, Department of Economics and Maynooth, and I'm delighted to propose a vote of thanks to Danny O'Hare and Michael Ryan for this very thought-provoking paper on the leaving cert point system used to determine higher education access. So as the authors note, the secondary in the paper, the secondary use of the leaving cert, the matching students to courses, has long ago overtaken its primary use, which is to certify the level of attainment reached by students in the exams. So, we know that in Ireland we discuss leaving cert exams, CAO applications, and the eventual points requirements far more than in any other country I know of. It's a national obsession. So the criticisms of the authors have the current system can be summarized in 3 points. Firstly, the distribution of marks differs between subjects. So marks in different subjects imply different levels through attainment. The grouping of marks into grade bands of 10% is unfair as it results in students with markedly different levels of attainment being treated equally. And the points attached to these grade bands result in a bimodal distribution that doesn't reflect our understanding of the underlying distribution of ability. The result, according to the authors, is a system that is unfair to students. The authors therefore propose an alternative system of points allocation based on students' percentile rank within subject, arguing that this would solve the aforementioned problems. I should first say that the paper, so to some extent, you did address the more recent years in the presentation, but in the paper and my comments, I don't address the serious problems with grade inflation that have arisen in the COVID years, 2020 to 2022. Grade inflation is a big problem. It seriously diminishes the discriminatory power of exams, and I hope and trust that the Department of Education has a plan to get us back to pre-COVID grade distributions. So I'm acting as though COVID hasn't happened. The author's main concern is that students may be missing out on courses to which other students with the same true level of attainment, or even lower levels of attainment, are admitted because of the different subjects they take, because of the grouping of marks into grades, and because of the way the points are allocated to different subjects. So the three problems all contribute to this. First point I would make is that this will happen in any system, no matter how accurately points reflect students' relative performance in their leaving cert exams. Illness, bereavements, stress, menstruation, all of these can affect students' performance on the day. Even more importantly, students with equal abilities may perform very differently due to the schools they attend. So as you mentioned in the presentation, the schools they attend, the teachers they're allocated, the grinds they get, the graduate trips and foreign language exchanges they can go on. It can't be emphasised enough that the playing field is not level for students sitting in the leaving cert. With my Maynooth colleagues, Lily and Sweetman, I've done research on the determinants of school performance, and family background becomes increasingly important as children move from primary into secondary school. So I'm instinctively nervous about any proposal that treats leaving cert marks as precise and unbiased estimates of true ability. But we'll just park that for the moment. The others particularly dislike random selection. In the paper, they talk about random selection quite a lot as a mechanism for reporting the place of course. I'm not convinced that the current system really is problematic in this respect. So to assess this, I had a look at the CAO points requirements for 2019. And what I saw was that there are about 1,000, a little over 1,000 different courses, which is more than I had realized, on offer through the CAO. So these are level 8 courses, and just 42, so about 4% of the final places allocated randomly. And while the number of students affected isn't published, it seems likely that's that number is pretty small, so I'm not too worried about random allocation of places. And when I look at the patterns in the random allocation of places, one of the most striking things is that this is really a Trinity problem. Of the 42 courses with random allocation, 17 were in Trinity College. About 30% of Trinity's courses had places randomly allocated, and other universities had between 0 and 4 courses that allocated places randomly. So since Trinity is known to have many of the highest points courses, it may seem that this tallies with the authors, the authors make a link between the random allocation and the limited number of possible points totals, particularly above 550 points. But only 7 of the 42 courses with randomly allocated places required more than 550 points. Many of the courses with random allocations were actually in nursing and teaching. So maybe gendered occupational preferences with all girls piling into particular subject choices as a bigger source of random allocation. I'm more sympathetic, so I'm not so worried about random allocation of courses, but I'm much more sympathetic to the author's concern that very different points distributions in different subjects mean that we're not comparing like with like when we add points from different subjects to arrive at total points. That's the nub of the problem. So this concern was discussed by McEgon et al. So your colleagues at the ERC have been talking about this for quite a while. So that was a 2007 paper. And this is a quote from that paper. Unequal dispersion of marks at leaving cert subjects has reached a level that raises questions not only about transparency, but also about the capacity of many subject examinations to describe accurately the levels of achievement. So they've been talking about that for quite a while. Because students take different subjects, students with similar aptitudes may get very different total points, and those with very different aptitudes may get the same points. And that's the problem. And this is the problem the author's proposed system is designed to solve. However, we have to realize that to take into account that the different subjects have different distributions of marks for 2 reasons. One is that subjects have over time evolved to have different grading systems and different grading norms. So some subjects are objectively easier to do well in than others for a student of a given level of ability. And awarding points according to students' percentile rankings will absolutely solve that problem. That is certain. But there's another reason for different distributions. The aptitude of students taking different subjects differ, and sometimes those differences are quite marked. And that can't be seen just by looking at the proportions of high grades in the exams each year. For example, in the paper in table 2, it shows that in 2016, almost 25% of students who took chemistry got H1 or H2 grades, as did over 26% of students who took applied maths. On the other hand, less than 16% of students taking history did. But this doesn't necessarily imply that history is more difficult than chemistry or applied maths, because it may be because the students, more able students, are taking the chemistry and applied maths than taking history. So this can be formally analysed by calculating the mean grade in a particular subject, let's call it subject A, and comparing it to the mean grade in the other subjects taken by the same students. Okay, so you're comparing like with like. So you're effectively asking, does this subject on average pull students' grades up or pull students' grades down? And happily, Callahan and Miller, so David Miller and the ERC, did exactly this in a paper in 2003. So it's quite old at this stage. But what he found was that chemistry was a particularly difficult subject, as were maths and French, and construction studies and technical drawing were relatively easy to do well. The implication of this is that just as grades obtained in different subjects are not comparable, percentile rankings in different subjects aren't either. Adopting a point system based on percentile rankings risks penalising students who choose subjects disproportionately taken by the more able students, and rewarding those who take the subjects chosen by disproportionately by the less able students. So in my view, the proposed system risks substituting one source of unfairness, that different subjects are easier or harder to do well in, with another arguable source of unfairness, that your points would depend not only on your own ability and effort, but on other students' ability and effort. So what cohort was taking a particular subject would become very important. In that case, encouraging students to take the subjects they have the most interest in or the most aptitude for. Instead of doing that, a ranking-based system would encourage students to take the subjects they believe to be taken by the weakest students. So you could have students targeting subjects that the weakest students have taken. And that, I think, this potential drawback would have to be investigated carefully. So, you know, how the risks balance out would have to be investigated carefully before we can proceed with the proposal. I do agree with the authors, though, that the fact that differences in grade distributions are partly due to some subjects being inherently easier than others causes problems of fairness. But maybe it would be better to address this directly by targeting, the Department of Education targeting particular shifts in the grade distribution in particular subjects over time. It would have to be done gradually. I haven't yet addressed the discussion of the grouping of marks into bands of 10 percentage points. I suspect that this is based on administrative considerations and a desire to keep appeals to a minimum. However, in this regard, one thing to point out is that in recent years, they have started releasing actual marks to students. A few days after the exams, they get their grades initially, and then they get their exact marks. And I presume that this has increased the number of appeals, but it doesn't seem to have created unmanageable delays. And I suspect that this is because they've largely moved to online marking, and it makes the administration of the appeals much quicker and much more efficient. So maybe a finer grading scheme, even within the existing system, is now possible, and that should be looked at. In summary, I think the paper highlights really important issues that need to be addressed by legal cert examiners. And even though I'm not completely persuaded by the author's proposed solution, I think the analysis can absolutely guide whatever future developments should arise going forward. Thank you very much. Thanks very much to the authors.
That we have a second vote of thanks from Paul Devereux in School of Economics in University College Dublin. This is slides.
Okay, so I want to second the vote of thanks. So my comments are somewhat correlated with Aidan's, unsurprisingly. I really enjoyed this paper. It has very interesting analysis of the current point system, very thought-provoking, and a great discussion of many of the technical problems with the current scheme. It suggests an alternative method which I probably won't belabor since I think you all know it, involves using the percentile rank in each subject and just adding the percentile rank across the 6 best subjects. Really, there's 2 issues here. There's percentile ranks versus marks, and there's whether you want to use exact scores or whether you want to group into grade bands. We'll talk about each of them. As you know, the rank is a nonlinear transformation from the mark. You basically get going from some sort of perhaps approximately normal distribution to a uniform distribution of outcomes. It's going to have effects. Uniform distribution has the situation that, you know, 10 percentiles in the top are going to imply big differences in marks because we're transforming a normal distribution to a uniform one, while 10 percentiles in the middle of the uniform distribution may involve very little difference in the mark. So 2 students with almost the same mark may have very, very different percentiles in the same distribution. So this is going to lead to a large increase in inequality, which may have greater mass and details. A point Aideen has made is marks induce students to take subjects with more generous grading, ranks induce students to take subjects with their peers. Sort of a phrase I kind of like from the health insurance literature, the adverse selection death spiral. You see with applied mathematics in 2022, you get 70%. That gives you an H3, gives you 77 points, all good. It puts you at the 35th percentile. Under the new scheme, you get 35 points. I'm thinking of doing it, I think I'll get about 70 percentile. I'm not going to do applied maths. I'll do something where I'm going to be at a higher percentile. But this is going to be systematic. People who expect to do badly are going to drop out. A year later, 70% would be at the 25th percentile. Maybe 2 years later, it'll be at the 5th percentile. Over time, slowly, sort of the bottom tail will drop out of applied maths. Fewer and fewer people will do it. And eventually, we're not going to have applied maths anymore. And that would be kind of sad because it's sort of a very important and difficult subject. Same issues arise with subjects like, say, ancient Greek. Ancient Greek is taken maybe in 2 different Greek schools. It's taken by I think, predominantly boys who are probably very talented and will do really well in it. I think most people who do ancient Greek get H1s. If we start ranking them, no one's going to do ancient Greek anymore by ancient Greek, and that would be a sad loss. So this kind of problem, I think it is systematic. Students are going to game the system. They're going to keep looking for the weaker peers. It is fixable. As Aideen said, you can sort of think about sort of taking account of student ability. Like you can think about what they do with World Golf Rank. They allocate points based on algorithm, but they take account of the quality of field in the tournament, how good the players are in the tournament. And you can need to do that here as well. So take account of maybe the math scores of people in this. As Aideen says, ranks don't solve the aggregation problem because of this general issue. Ranks also have this interesting characteristic that they're zero sum. If someone else is better, we put it down. Another sports analogy is kind of like VAR. I celebrate my leaving cert scores, but then other people appeal and mine go down. Again, I don't know how much students are going to like that their points are falling because of the people successfully feel. And obviously the biggest incentive to appeal with ranks would be in the center of the distribution, because that's where a few extra points could make a huge difference in the rank, which is different from the current situation. With grade bands, I thought one thing the paper could talk a little bit more about is why does everyone use grades? You know, every college, every school, every country, every education level, they very rarely do they use exact score. They tend to use grading bands, and I think the paper could talk more about that. And they use it in all sorts of circumstances. Even when they need to aggregate, like the UCD GPA is based on aggregating grades, not aggregating scores or ranks or anything else like that. As Aideen says, the grade bands create lotteries. She doesn't think it's a big deal. I don't think it's a big deal either, for various reasons. And one of the points is that, you know, first of all, there's not the full substitutes from Oxford courses. Most people get one of their top 3 courses anyway. And the required points typically don't represent the required aptitudes for the university course. So you need 625 to do economics and finance. You need 440 to do economics, maths, and statistics in UCD. Which one is harder? Who knows? So it doesn't seem critical from a social perspective that we get this exacting one, even though it may adversely affect a few individual students that they get. And there are arguments out there like Michael Sandlin, attorney in merit, that you should do lotteries. You should just take everyone who's eligible for college and just use lotteries to see what they get. And that may be an improvement, and some countries do that for certain courses like medicine. Just reading this paper, I thought of other issues like, should we, even if we don't use rank, should we tell students their rank? Should we certify it? One of the weaknesses of the current system is that students, they do take their exact marks, but they can't certify them. They can't put them on their CV. They can't use them in job applications. Increasingly, there's anecdotal evidence, I think, that employers don't really trust college grades. There's some grade inflation, not really much into them. They probably have more faith in leaving cert grades. It would probably be particularly valuable to employers to see you in their ranks. If you're in the top 100 in the country in mathematics in the leaving cert, that really says something about your abilities. I think that might be useful. Another thing is we could move away from a single index of performance. In some of my prior work with Judith Delaney, we saw that, for example, maths grades are a better predictor of college success in STEM subjects than they are in other subjects. Why not put more weight on mathematics, more quantitative or stuff like that? Zadie says there are bigger issues with the leaving cert, I think, than some of the grading and points-based issues. These are some that are sort of dear to my heart. You will all have your own list about what we think could be done to improve the leaving cert. So I'll skip through that. And finally, I'll finish with some suggestions for the paper. I would have valued having more information about the SEC data you have access to, because it sort of helped me to think of what more you can do if I knew more about what data you actually have. One of the things I thought maybe you can do, but I'm not sure because I don't know what data you have, is just calculate the points under your new alternative system. And let's see what the distribution looks like. I suspect there'll be a massive increase in variance on the new distribution. I don't know if students will like that because it exposes them to higher risk at some level. But it'd be interesting to see how high is the correlation with the points under the existing grading system. And sort of really compare to see how big a difference it would make. I mean, ideally, you go further, you link your data to CAO data, you figure out would it actually change the course of people will get into. Ideally, you go further and you can link it with HEA data and you see whether it actually changed how well people do in college. They're all infeasible, but maybe this is feasible. One other point, there's a lot of discussion about grading error, but I think it's right on the money that grading error is an issue. It's going to differ depending on the system, but I'm not convinced by the arguments in the paper that it's exacerbated by using grade bands. I think really these claims need formalization, they need proofs. I think it's difficult to prove it formally probably, but you could do some simulations where you actually take the distribution of marks, add some measurement error, and create grade bands, do it without grade bands and see which gets closer to having the right points. And the last thing I'd say is that ranks are reasonably widely used. For example, Texas is a rule that if you're the top 10% in your high school in terms of GPA, you're guaranteed admission to one of the main colleges in Texas. And ranks are used for certain other things. I suggest bringing in some of this literature. For example, there's studies in Texas that shows that people game the system because there's a 10% rule. They start sending their children to worse schools in terms of peers than they would have otherwise, because they want to give their kids a better chance of being in the top 10% in their high school. And this is sort of equivalent to the kind of issues you're going to get in the ranks in the subjects that people would switch subjects systematically. But I think a general issue I would say with the paper is that if you look at the list of references, it doesn't have a huge body of references from the education literature, from the literature about relative performance incentives. And I think there's a lot of work being done on these kind of issues, and it would probably add value to the paper rather than it. But overall, I thought it was really interesting, very thought-provoking, and I enjoyed reading it. Thank you.
So I do want to give the authors a chance to respond, but on the other hand, maybe it's useful to hear what people are thinking, both online and in the room. So I hope that's all right. If we keep going with the comments, it's an excellent paper. It's very enriching to hear the comments. So do we have anyone in the room who'd like to go, or any questions, or online? Just put up your hand. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Brendan O'Dowd from the CSO. Thanks for a very interesting and thought-provoking paper. Something that occurred to me is that I think that if you had a perfectly fair system in which there were mandatory and optional subjects, you would expect to see differences in mark distribution by virtue of the fact that people are choosing subjects in which they have an aptitude. So that's just on the mandatory versus optional subjects. But also I think that some subjects are highly specialized, and in those you would expect to have, again, a different mark distribution. For example, subjects that are generally taken as an 8th subject are taken outside of school, like music or applied maths. And also in languages where there's a higher likelihood that the student has it as their mother tongue, like perhaps Polish or Arab. That's one point. I don't agree that it is a bimodal graph. I think that's an aesthetic artifact caused by a difference in bin size. And there was a third point, but I don't remember. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Any other in the room? Go ahead.
Really interesting paper, which establishes, I think, the questions to ask about the current system. Any sense of what the department thinks of this? Are they resistant to change, or is there an openness to looking at an alternative system?
You could only guess the answer to that. I think it is. You might want to elaborate on that, but that's here I am. There is a huge debate on which newspapers are publicly even in talking with the Irish Universities Association about definitions, it's completely disappointed that there wasn't an openness even to query the issue, like to explore the issue. I was hugely surprised that the initiative will engage the university in the education sector much more than it seems.
So I'll ask again online, is there people with questions? And I'll invite then maybe Michael or Danny to come up to the mic to answer what you've heard. Patrick Cohen. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks very much. I really enjoyed this paper, and I just wanted to say that I thought this is an ideal topic and an ideal paper for the society, because I can't imagine any other body or any other forum in the country that would have people who are as interested in this kind of an issue. The sort of questions that I was beginning to formulate as the paper was going on, I found addressed by Aideen and Paul in their terrific discussions. So I just want to make one overall point, and that is, I missed, maybe it's in the paper and maybe I've just sort of missed it, but I missed a statement of what the objective, what are we trying to optimize here? I know we're all trying to optimize in some way people's progression through the educational system, but making it a little bit more precise than that. It's unlikely that there is a perfect system for aggregating any kind of results from half a dozen exam subjects, that different subjects chosen by people, and then saying that with that single number you can go on and have a go at any other subject in university. But I did miss, there was a sort of general sense that we're talking about ability, and an idea that just getting a ranking of ability, that's what we're aiming at. But is that really the aim? Of course it's not. It's an approximation to what the real aim of the system is.
Excellent. So Michael, do you want to go up? Hard question.
Well, first, really, thanks to everybody who commented and raised such excellent points. couple of things. Number one, the distinction between the student's standard in the subject and their competitive performance compared to other students. There's always, I think, a tendency to confuse, somehow or another, merge those two together. The competitive performance of the student compared to other students is relatively easy to identify in a way. You just have to look at the mark, it indicates their performance in the exam. Now, people have talked about percentiles. That actually isn't what we were suggesting. This is a little different, but that doesn't matter. But the competitive performance is one thing, the standard is another, or the aptitude, or whatever. And one could go so far as to say that it's impossible. And the best you can do is to be able to say, if somebody is expected to know something about something, they should be prepared to answer questions about it. How on earth do we arrive at the appropriate questions? How on earth do we evaluate the answers? How do we do that in a way that a number that you get at the end of that can be interpreted as a measure of the student's knowledge of the subject? To me, that's the key problem that the State Examination Commission addresses and does its living best to address well. So the mark you get at the end for an exam can be interpreted as some kind of indication of the standard the student has in the subject. Quite a different standard altogether is the standard that is the ability of the student in relation to the subject. How they've performed, standard they've reached in the subject of it in the exam. Well, it wouldn't be correct to say it has nothing to do with their aptitude for the subject, but all kinds of factors, as people have said, comes into all that. So to me, and I think to Danny, a key point is, to at all the time keep a clear distinction between those two different objectives. And I don't think identifying the student's aptitude for the subject is one of the objectives. I think it would be very nice if it would be, but it's very, very hard to see how one can hope to reduce that to a number. On the other hand, you can have some hope of coming up with a number that indicates the student's level of knowledge of the subject. Fine, that's the number. The competitive question is quite different. And the competitive question is, how well is the student done compared to other students? There's many ways we might try to address that. We've suggested one approach. And quite take the point that one of the speakers made, that, for example, in subjects like ancient Greece, or ancient Greek, where the numbers are small and so on and so forth, you may well feel that, the whole approach of making, but the problem, the underlying problem is competitive. There will be no need for re-insert points were we to address the really bad problem, which is that you've well-qualified young people wishing to study a certain subject, and there aren't enough places there to take them. There's a number of ways we may try to approach them. But really, if we'll see if the points that can make, just to say something about it, but I think to us, in a way, to keep clear about the difference between, let's say, the standard the student has achieved in the subject and how well the student has done compared to other students. There really are two ideas that cannot be concluded. There are different kinds of ideas. Just in relation to some of the points that were made, one of them being about, for example, the shortage of references, guilty as charged, and we might try to do something about that. The fact that random selection is used relatively rarely for admission to many of the courses, St. Trinity, and so on and so forth. Well, that's nice to know, but realistically, if two students have different performances, it's really a sad day when what happens is based on the toss of the coin. And to try to find some way of sort of being clear about how one can resolve the thing, because it would seem the present system really isn't very good for it. There were other things I meant to say, and there were other excellent points made. And I made mental notes, and for some reason they seem to have gone off somewhere. Yes, random selection. When students have, for example, a difference of 9 marks, as in the current system. The last point I tried to make, and my apologies for not covering the points that you made more adequately. It's really, there's a motto in computing. It's usually summarized as KIS, sometimes KISS. And it stands for keep it simple. Keep it simple. Whatever system is put in place, yes, exactly. Whatever system is put in place, it would be very good to avoid making it so complex that, you know, if we can keep it simple, it reduces the possibilities of gaming it, makes it clear to everybody what they're getting into, and so on. And so to keep it simple, try to distinguish clearly between the standard of somebody in a subject and the competitive performance. And we're stuck with the competitive performance thing, unfortunately, for as long as competition is needed. Once upon a time, which by the way, I believe Danny O'Hare remembers reasonably well, and I certainly remember it, there was none of this competition stuff. You got 2 leave, you got 2 honors maybe, you walked into the hall where they were registering you. I was half thinking of becoming a brain surgeon, but there was a huge queue for medicine. And there was a really, really short queue for maths. So I signed up for the maths. And by the way, I'm not the only one who behaved like that. It really is a shame we can't try to do something more effective about providing places that are needed. So I better stop talking, I'm afraid, but thanks to the society again, and to both of the responders, and apologies for not dealing more adequately with your points. For us, it's really good to have the issue being considered by this society. And we do hope that people in the department and so on will start to address some of the things.
Thank you very much. So you will have a chance, obviously, to revise the paper because Kira she's online and I'm here. So you will be revising the paper to incorporate these comments, and the discussants will be writing them up. And we are going to do little policy briefs, little notes to the relevant departments of each paper that's actually produced in the society. So we are going to do that as well. So this is not over in that sense. You're going to get a chance to incorporate the comments and follow. So I'll hand it over to John to wrap up.
Thanks, Paul. Just 2 comments. If people would like to make comments and have them included on the record, can send them on to Secretary at Statistical. And then our next meeting is scheduled for April 20th. It's a symposium, and we're still working on the topic, but it's likely to be related to ongoing developments in the banking sector. And we see no interest in that case. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you to everyone online for coming up. And we'll see you next time.